I speak in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. You may be seated. I want to start off this morning by sharing with you about my grandfather. I want to tell you about my grandfather. And I think I've shared this before a couple years ago, so if you've heard it, just hang in there. There are others here who haven't, and we'll get where we're going, I promise. This is what I want to say about my grandfather. My grandfather was the Marlboro Man. Most of you here are old enough to understand that reference. In the younger crowd, thankfully our children might not know what I mean by that, and that's a good thing. This is what I mean by it. Not that he smoked, he didn't smoke, but he was a true cowboy. He was born and raised in Oklahoma, and he was a lifelong cattle rancher who worked cows on horseback as long as he could. The only foot coverings he owned, literally, were cowboy boots. He didn't own any sneakers. He didn't own any church shoes. He didn't own any slippers. He either had on cowboy boots or he was barefooted. And he never, ever, ever was caught outside without a cowboy hat on. Right? His skin was burnt like leather from a life in the sun. And I always thought this was cool when I was a little boy. He chomped on a cigar all day long. He never lit the cigar, it was his chewing tobacco. So he just chomped on it, and as it got down and he'd spit it like they do, and then he'd open up another one, he'd start chomping on that one. He chomped on a cigar all day long. And he was tough and grizzled and sinewy and strong, and I remember as a young man, even when he was well past 80 years old, he used to say to me, "You want to arm wrestle?" And I knew enough, even as a young man, not to lose an arm wrestling match to my cowboy grandfather. He was a hard-working family man who took care of his own. He was fun and funny and fun to be around, at least to me. I always had it in mind. It wasn't this way, I'm sure, but especially when I was younger, I always had it in mind that of all of his grandchildren, I was his favorite, right? He was nice and kind, at least to me. I saw him out working cows and in the sale yard, and he could be tough and even mean. But to me, he was always gentle and kind. And because of that, if you can imagine in an age when we still, our heroes were, at least for boys, were still cowboys. We had cowboy shows on TV and in the movies, and in an age of Roy Rogers and John Wayne and Clint Eastwood, that was my grandfather, and that's really cool. And so I really, especially when I was young, I wanted to be him. And I adored him, and I loved him. And that's all I want to say about that. I'll introduce you to a new family member every week, and then I'll just put that aside for a time. Now I want to go back to the gospel. Jesus said, as you heard this morning, Jesus said, "I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother," and those are shocking things. Daughter-in-law against mother-in-law, less shocking. But still maybe a little bit shocking that it's right there in the Bible. He says, your own family members will be your enemies. He said, whoever loves their children more than me is not worthy of me. He said, fear him who can destroy both body and soul in hell. So that's just a sample of what we heard. This passage is chock full of what preachers call the difficult, or the hard sayings of Jesus. These sayings, this reading, is the real reason why preachers are always trying to go on vacation in June, so they don't have to be here trying to explain it all, right? We'd rather just skip over it. This is what I call a skip it Sunday. Like, I'd just rather skip it. But that's not a choice for us. You know, if you're an old-time Episcopalian, you might say, well, why not just preach? We had a beautiful reading from Romans, beautifully read, by the way, a beautiful reading from Romans. Why not just preach on that, or even the Old Testament? And here's the thing about that. Again, if you have been a part of this church or any Episcopal church for any length of time, you know that of all of the readings that are prescribed for any given Sunday, the only one we're required to read is the gospel reading, right? The other two are not quite, but somewhat optional, and we always add one. And so here's the thing. If I did that, we're all going to hear Jesus say those difficult things that he said about setting a man against his father and a daughter against her mother and all of those other hard things. We're all going to hear Jesus say that he came to bring a sword and that other things about hell and about bearing a cross. We're going to hear all of that anyways. So we can either ignore that and let that stand there as the elephant in the room while I talk about Romans, or we can turn and face these hard sayings head on, and that's what we're going to do. This is one reason, by the way, that Bible study is so important, right? Because the Bible is not always easy to understand. And the Bible, even when it is easy to understand, is not always easy to hear, if you understand my meaning. And if we don't grapple with these hard sayings and do it together, it's all that much easier to ignore the hard sayings altogether, or worse, to have them, when we don't understand them, to have these hard sayings sort of push us away from Jesus rather than pull us into Jesus, right? We have to grapple with the hard sayings. So what we do in this case is, first of all, we ask ourselves, what might these words have meant for those who heard them first? Here, Jesus is talking to his original 12 apostles, his closest group, inner circle, first set of disciples. If you fast forward when Matthew was writing this, Matthew's also writing to a similar group, and that Jesus' first 12 and his inner core of group, they were religious and ethnic Jews, as was Matthew's early community, right? Ethnic and religious Jews who had nevertheless come to understand their ancient faith in a new way because of the light of Christ. And that new understanding of their relationship with God through Christ compelled them then to begin to live in new and different ways. It compelled them to relate to people, to each other, to their family, friends, to society at large in new and different ways. And those new and different ways of living, Jesus was saying, will eventually, inevitably, bring them into conflict with people and with society, especially with the people they love, their family and friends. So this passage about conflict that can arise in families even because of Jesus is simply a warning. It's a warning to those who had just begun to follow Jesus, right? We're early in the story, relatively early. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, you've been following me, you've been with me for a little bit. Mostly until now, you've just been listening to what I have to say and going about with me. Now things are going to get real because I'm going to send you out to do what I've been doing. And to follow me has to mean something more than just what you hear. To follow me has to mean a change in who you are, how you live, what you do. And that change in the way that you live is probably going to cost you in terms of relationship, sooner or later. And it wasn't just that people were living according to certain religious rules that were now not following those rules, not just alongside their family members, not just skipping dietary restrictions, for example, not just skipping temple sacrifices or religious ceremonies, but changing the whole way that they lived, such that, and the way that they interacted with people, with strangers, with groups that before were forbidden to interact with, right? If you follow Jesus, there are no forbidden groups. And their old way of living said that you have to be only with these people. You can't interact with those or those or those. because if you do so, it will make you religiously impure, and then we have to stay away from you. And they were saying, I can't get with that anymore. Because of Jesus, I have to love all people, right? They were living differently. They had a whole new understanding of a life and love and family. And those changes in the way that they lived and related to people because of Christ, those changes made family and friends oftentimes hurt and angry and sad. And so there was in strained and sometimes broken relationships a price to pay for following Jesus. If you have a hard time understanding what that might look like, when it happened 2,000 years ago, when these religious Israelites began to live in a new and different way, think of if you've ever had somebody in your family who converted to another religion. I have an uncle in my family who became a Jehovah's Witness. And everything changed for him when that happened, right? He, as they say, he wouldn't come to Christmas anymore. He wouldn't go to weddings or funerals anymore. He, in some ways, in minor ways, he wouldn't eat what we've always eaten at family reunions. Sometimes, people join different groups and they change a lot more about themselves. And what happens is it can drive a wedge in relationships. I know it broke my grandmother's heart that my uncle wouldn't come to Christmas anymore, and he wouldn't come to weddings and funerals, you see. It was the same way with the earliest followers of Jesus. They were living their life in a new way that made their old relationships sometimes be strained. So these warnings about family division and strife are simply warnings about the potential cost of discipleship. They applied to Jesus' first followers, and they apply to us today. Because being a follower of Jesus, a disciple of Christ, will, if you're doing it right, it will eventually cost you something. Or to put it the other way around, as I so many times have said from here, if you are finding the living of your Christian faith to be really easy, you might not be doing it right. Right? Because being a disciple of the Prince of Peace should mean something about what we think about violence in our world. Being a follower of the one who fed 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish, or being a follower of the God who was born in a barn to an unwed mother and died on a cross, hated by society, being a follower of that person ought to mean something about how we respond to hunger and poverty in a world of abundance, or how we respond to those who are marginalized and hated and rejected in our society. We could go on. Being a follower of the author of mercy and justice should mean something to us about how we live into mercy and justice and forgiveness in our lives. Finally, being a follower of the Lord of love, it has to mean something about who we are and how we live our lives. And when we live like that, if it really means something, such that we change who we are and how we live, when, not if, we do so, doing so will present us with a cost, sooner or later, of a strained or a broken relationship. And that cost may end up being a cost that we simply have to pay if we want to continue having the privilege of calling ourselves His. Which brings me back to my grandfather and why I introduced him to you. As I said, I adored him. I wanted to be him. And I loved him dearly. I still do. But as I grew into be a young man, one thing that I probably knew about him when I was a child, but I couldn't explain it with words, but when I became a young man and I could describe it, this is what I found out about my grandfather, whom I adored, is that he was entrenched racist. And being a young man, and especially at that time a young Christian, I understood immediately what it meant to have the truth of Jesus Christ put a strain on a relationship of love. Because in that moment, then, as a young Christian man, I knew when I heard my grandfather say a racial slur that I had to say something, right? I had to stand up and say, Papa, we called him Papa. I said, Papa, I don't like those words, and I don't want you to say them when I'm here. And he would say, well, it's my house, or something like that. And it made our relationship strained. I still loved him. I didn't love that part of him. And I wished and prayed that that part of him would be removed and thrown away. But when you're a follower of Jesus Christ, there will come times when you are compelled to stand up for what Jesus would have stood up for. And sometimes standing up in that way will cost you a relationship. Sometimes the relationship will be strained, sometimes it will be broken. Thankfully, in my case with my grandfather, it stayed at strained. He didn't require me to think or believe like he did in order to stay in the family, and I didn't force him out of my life completely because of that part of him. But being a follower of Christ made that relationship get pulled. Here's the point. Discipleship, following Jesus Christ, cannot be a sectioned off part of your life. Discipleship, in the end, can only be your life. Your whole life has to be shot through with the truth of Jesus Christ, and that's a challenge. But that's the life of discipleship. Lucky for us, here in this wonderful church, that's the community we're trying to build. A community of disciples in relationship with each other, each helping the other, live more and more fully every day into the life of discipleship, which here we describe as a life of prayer and study and worship and service and giving and fellowship. We are here, all members of this wonderful community of what Father Remington called at 9 o'clock, being coaches, being mentors to each other. Not just from here to there, but from there to here and all around. There's no such thing as a perfect disciple, only followers of Christ who are trying new every day to be a better disciple. At the end of the day, discipleship means simply but not easily. Simple and easy are not the same thing. But at the end of the day, being a disciple means simply living a life of self-giving love, giving yourself away for the sake of love every day, and especially loving and caring and holding those whom the world tells you to hate, and there are no shortage of those. It is challenging, but it should be. Here's the good news, though, wrapped up in all of this, is that the Lord never sent away any who weren't ready yet to take on the full mantle of discipleship, right? This story, Jesus is talking to the 12, and it doesn't end up like this. We presume they all 12 went out. They received their warnings and their instructions, and they went out, and probably many of them did have ruptured relationships because of the way that they were living. But if one of those 12 would have said, you know what, Jesus, I get what you're saying, and I'm not there yet, brother. I'm not quite ready. Jesus would not have said, well, then, away with you. So he doesn't ask us to leave even if we're not ready yet. In fact, he wants us to stay. So if as you sit here, you're sitting, as you hear these warnings about the cost or the potential cost of discipleship, if you are saying to yourself, I can't, not yet, the good news is that that's fine. Jesus still loves you, and he still wants you, and he's a patient Lord. So hang around and take small steps. There are some days when each and every one of us can only take a small step of discipleship. This church is designed to help us all live into our call to be a disciple, to live a life of love. It takes practice. That's what we're here for, to help each other, to commit, to learn, to say our prayers every day, to open the Bible and read it and study it every day, to commit to coming and worshiping the living God once a week, to have a ministry out amongst the least of these in Jesus' name, to give of our material blessings sacrificially to the building of the kingdom. It is a challenge, and some days are hard, some days will be hard, some days will be easy. Here's the other good news, is that every day in the life of a disciple is a day that you belong to Jesus Christ, so every day, whether it's challenging or easy, is a great day. So as this reading says, I would encourage you, do take up your cross, saints, take up your cross, disciples. When you do, you will discover, paradoxically, if I could misquote another line of Scripture, when you take up your cross, you will discover paradoxically that his yoke is easy and his burden is a delight. Amen.